A young girl stood under the scorching sun, selling lemonade to save her dying brother's life, while strangers walked past, laughing, shaking their heads, and calling her pathetic. Then suddenly, the ground began to shake. The air filled with a deep, thunderous roar as dozens of Hell's Angels motorcycles rolled in, their engines echoing like a storm from heaven. What happened next didn't just save one child's life. It exposed the truest meaning of kindness, forced an entire town to face itself, and reminded the world that sometimes angels ride on two wheels. Before we dive deeper into this powerful story, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this one will leave you speechless. The afternoon sun hung like a heavy coin over the cracked asphalt, pressing heat into the town until everything shimmered. Cars whispered by with windows rolled up and air conditioners hissing. And on the corner where the sidewalk buckled, a child stood beside a plastic table that wobbled with every passing truck. She was small for 9, light brown skin glinting with sweat, hair tied back in a puff that frizzed at the edges from the heat. Her name was Amara, and she had counted exactly 64 paper cups, a plastic pitcher cloudy from years of use, and a cardboard sign written with marker that bled at the edges from condensation. For my brother's surgery, 50 cents a cup. The letters neat because she had promised herself neatness would make people stop. She had practiced the rhythm of pouring at the sink that morning while her mother made a list of overdue bills she could not bear to read aloud. She had measured lemons and sugar with the seriousness of someone casting a spell, because superstition felt like a kind of courage. Every slice of lemon was a small prayer, every stir of the spoon a promise she would not let the world pretend it didn't see her brother. She set out alone when the heat was still rising, wrestling the folding legs of the table that pinched her fingers, then smoothing the cardboard sign 3 times for luck. By 10 in the morning, her shirt clung to her back, and ants were already exploring the sticky ring beneath the pitcher. People passed with the insulated focus of grown-ups intent on errands that mattered only to them. A woman in scrubs checked a phone, glanced at the sign, and kept moving. A pair of teenagers cruising on boards laughed at nothing in particular and rolled by, wheels clicking like insects. A man in a delivery truck paused long enough to lift his eyes to the word surgery and then looked away, as if the world could swallow a child need with a single blink. Amara learned the grammar of indifference quickly, eyes softening for a beat, faces scrunching with a sympathy that cost nothing, shoulders tightening with the effort of choosing not to stop. She learned to read the moment when a stranger saw the word brother and performed the complicated math of time, money, discomfort, and decided no. She did not beg. She had promised her mother she would never beg. She would simply be there, steady as a mile marker, with a product and a hope. When a breeze came, it made her sign flutter and the clear water in the pitcher wink like a trick. The lemons, thin wheels floating at the top, bumped the lip as if trying to escape. She poured carefully for the handful of people who did pause, counting quarters and thank yous with solemnity, tucking the coins into a jar that used to hold pasta sauce. Every time the jar rang, she pictured a machine in a hospital that beeped at a steady pace, and she imagined it smoothing out instead of stuttering like it sometimes did when she visited. Her brother's name was Jonah, and he had the kind of eyes that made nurses speak gently. The doctors had said the word congenital, and then more words that sounded like a staircase too steep for small legs. Amara translated all of it into a simple sentence inside her chest. This costs more than we have, and the clock is loud. She could still smell the hospital from 2 days before, antiseptic and something floral that didn't belong, and she could still see her mother's hands, steady in front of Jonah, but shaking in the hallway. The social worker had given them a pamphlet with a blush of hope, grants and applications and waiting lists, and Amara had gone home and filled a notebook with ideas, most of them impossible. The lemonade stand was the only one she could carry by herself. Heat pooled in the valley of her elbows and her socks felt like damp clay. Across the street, a digital sign in front of the pharmacy flashed that the temperature was 102, then 103, as if the day were showing off. She shifted her weight from foot to foot and tried to keep her face open, because someone might be looking. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it, telling herself that hunger could be folded and tucked into the waistband of patience. A police cruiser slowed at the light, and for a second she imagined a warning to pack up, But the car rolled on, the officer staring straight ahead, the dog in the back panting a pink laugh. Her first pitcher emptied around noon. She lugged a jug of water from the cooler and refilled, stirring with the long wooden spoon, adding sugar until the taste balanced on her tongue like sunlight and shade. She had calculated how many cups one pitcher made, and how many pitchers she could make before the ice melted into uselessness. She had also calculated how many cups 50 cents could buy in a hospital, and the number was so small she refused to write it down. She focused on cups, on the ritual of lift, pour, pass, on the way a child can make ritual into armor. A group of office workers came by in lanyards, talking about a deadline that sounded like doom. One pointed, smirked without malice, and said something Amara could not hear, but understood anyway. They did not stop. A man with a lawn service truck pulled up and said he'd be back after the next yard. He wasn't. A woman with a stroller approached, and then turned abruptly as if the air itself had pushed her away. The jar grew heavier by ounces when she needed pounds. A whisper began in the back of her mind that maybe this was a story about foolishness, that people love the idea of children saving the day, but rarely let the idea become a receipt. She thought about quitting around 2, when the blacktop steamed and the pitcher sweated like a creature. She imagined going home, standing at the sink, saying she had tried, and that trying ought to count. But the word count felt brittle when set beside the word surgery. She stayed. She adjusted her sign so the crease didn't hide the 0 and 50. She straightened the cups so their rims made a neat horizon. She stood taller so Hope could see her. It was the sound that changed the day, a sound that rolled under the heat and shook grit loose from the curb. At first it was a hum like a storm thinking. Then it was a growl like thunder remembering its own name. Heads turned. Birds lifted abruptly from the sagging power line. The engines arrived in a procession, chrome catching sun in flashes that felt like cameras. Motorcycles filled the block like a rumor growing legs, and the air shifted from hot to charged. Leather vests, patchwork stories stitched on backs, boots that understood distance. The town's gaze followed them with the caution people reserve for things they've decided are dangerous. Amara's hand shook once as she lifted the pitcher, then steadied. The bikes lined the curb in a choreography that suggested practice. Helmets came off, revealing faces both hard and human. The nearest rider swung his leg over the seat and stood, a wall of tattoos that told their own biography in ink. He took in the table, the sign, the small figure not stepping back, and his expression softened in a way that made the heat seem briefly survivable. He reached for his wallet and pulled out bills that looked too large for the jar. Then another rider did the same. Then another. The jar took on a new sound, not the clink of coins but the hush of folded paper. A circle formed around the table, not threatening, not possessive, simply protective in a way the town hadn't been all day. The men were careful with her cups, careful with her space, careful with their words in the way people become when they remember the world is full of children. A woman rider with a braid like a rope brought a bag of ice from the convenience store without being asked. Someone angled a bike to throw shade onto the table, and though it only trimmed the edge of the sun, the gesture landed like rain. Across the street, skeptics gathered behind sunglasses. Some pretended not to stare, others stared on purpose, needing their suspicion to be seen. A few held up phones as if filming would make them part of something safer than participation. Amara felt the opposite of invisible for the first time that day, and the feeling was both frightening and holy. She poured and passed and whispered thank you so many times the words began to dissolve on her tongue, then form again, fresh as new sugar. News traveled faster than traffic. By 3, more bikes throbbed their way into the block. The corner became a rumor of generosity. The jar filled, and she swapped it out for a larger one someone found in a trunk. The bills smelled like gas and leather and 1,000 hands, and each one seemed to weigh more than paper should, as if kindness had mass. A rider with gray in his beard knelt to adjust the leg of the table so it would stop wobbling. Another arranged the cups within easy reach. The braid-haired woman wiped Amara's forehead with a clean bandana and placed a bottle of water by her elbow with military precision. It was impossible not to imagine the hospital then. The sterile brightness flipped into a different kind of light, the beep of machines moderated by a number on a form that finally made sense. She pictured Jonah's chest rising without effort, his fingers loosening with sleep that didn't scare nurses. She pictured her mother's shoulders lowering from around her ears. She felt a word gather behind her ribs, not miracle exactly, because miracles felt like things the universe did to show off. This felt like work, loud and public and stitched together by strangers who had decided a child would not fail on their watch. Every act of generosity drew echoes. A delivery driver who had avoided eye contact earlier returned with a crate of bottled water, mumbling something that sounded like apology shaped as logistics. The teenagers circled back and, red with embarrassment, bought 3 cups they didn't want. The woman with the stroller left a tin under the pitcher when she thought no one was looking. Even the officer with the dog rolled by again more slowly, the dog's ears tilted toward the congregation of engines and people, the officer's jaw unclenched. The sun slid down the sky with a kind of exhausted grace. Heat retreated in increments. Shadows lengthened like promises. Amara's legs trembled from standing, but she refused the chair someone offered because refusal felt like part of the vow. She counted in her head the way her teacher had taught, grouping bills, imagining columns and totals, translating generosity into the cold arithmetic of hospital invoices. She knew the number needed was still far, and yet the distance no longer felt like a cliff. Somewhere at the far end of the block, a big bike idled and would not park. Its rider watched the scene for a long time, visor down, as if measuring the moment against a private history. When he finally cut the engine and approached, the group opened with the unspoken respect of people who organized themselves without being told. His vest bore a patch that meant more than decoration. Even Amara, who did not know the code of leather and thread, sensed it. He stood a foot away from the table, looked at the sign, looked at the child who had refused to give up her corner to heat and indifference, and reached inside his jacket. The envelope he placed on the table was thick enough to make the plastic dip. He slid it gently, as if heavy things break easily. Then he touched 2 fingers to the brim of his helmet in a gesture that felt older than the town, older than engines. Though no words passed between them, the message was simple enough to translate without language. The engines behind him rumbled like approval. The town's breath hitched. Amara blinked at the envelope, and then at the jar that had become a monument to paper and hope. She did not open it. She did not need to see numbers yet. She tucked it under the pitcher where the condensation would not reach, and kept working, because work felt like gratitude that moved. The line of riders thinned as evening crept in, each leaving with the careful nod of someone who had been given a chance to balance a scale, however briefly. When the last cup emptied and the sign curled at the corners from damp, she packed with the same care she had started, reversing the ritual. The table fought her again, and she won again. She hugged the heavy jar to her chest like a lantern and walked home with steps that shook the dust loose from their hiding places. The envelope rode in her backpack like a heartbeat. Behind her, a single engine escorted at a distance, not to frighten, but to ensure, turning off only when her building came into view. Upstairs, the apartment smelled like soap and old coffee. Her mother sat at the table with a stack of forms, lips pressed into a line of tired courage. In the bedroom, Jonah slept on his side with the careful stillness of someone who has learned to bargain with pain. The evening light fell across his forehead in a thin stripe. Amara placed the jar on the table and slid the envelope beside it, palms flat, pulse loud. The night after the bikers came felt like a dream that didn't know how to end. Amara could barely sleep, her hands still sticky with lemonade and her heart still racing from the roar of engines that had swallowed the sun. The envelope lay beside her pillow, heavy with mystery and promise. She hadn't opened it yet. She couldn't. Her mother had come home late from the hospital, her eyes red from exhaustion, and Amara had simply placed the envelope in her palm, without a word. Her mother didn't speak either. They just sat there, 2 halves of the same fear, as the fan hummed and the city outside sighed itself to sleep. When morning came, Amara woke to the smell of something sweet. Her mother was in the kitchen, stirring pap over the gas flame, humming softly for the first time in weeks. Amara blinked at the sunlight spilling through the torn curtains and thought maybe the day had decided to be kind. Her mother's voice broke the quiet. "They came," she said. Her voice trembled on the words. "Those men. They came to the hospital before sunrise." Amara froze. "The bikers." Her mother nodded, tears bright as dew. "They paid the deposit, Amara. The whole thing. Your brother's surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning." The bowl in Amara's hands nearly slipped. For a second, everything inside her, all the worry, the exhaustion, the pretending to be brave, collapsed into something bright and trembling. She didn't cry, not yet. She just stood there, barefoot, her chest rising and falling too fast, as if her body couldn't catch up with the miracle her ears had just heard. All day the neighborhood buzzed. Word traveled faster than the harmattan wind. The little girl who sold lemonade for her sick brother had been saved by the very men everyone feared. Some refused to believe it. Others whispered that maybe it was a trick or a prank. But Amara knew what she saw. The rumbling of engines, the heavy boots, the rough hands that turned gentle when they dropped money into her jar. They were real. And for once, kindness had worn leather and steel instead of suits and sermons. The sun climbed high, bleaching the world gold. Amara spent the morning at the hospital with her mother, clutching Jonah's tiny hand. Machines beeped softly beside his bed, each sound a small promise that tomorrow would come. He looked weak, too pale, too still, but when he saw her, he smiled with a kind of quiet bravery that made her chest ache. She whispered stories to him, how the bikers came, how their engines growled like lions, how one of them brought ice for her lemonade so it wouldn't melt. He listened, his lips twitching with a faint grin, and said nothing. He didn't need to. Outside the ward, the nurse shook her head in disbelief. "You mean bikers?" she asked Amara's mother. "Real ones. Tattoos, leather jackets." "Yes," her mother said softly. "Real ones. And they didn't ask for anything. They just said, 'Tell the little one she's got a family now.'" By afternoon, the heat outside was merciless again. Amara stood by the hospital gate, the jar of leftover money still half full. She had thought of giving it back, but something told her it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about finishing what she started. She wanted to thank them. She wanted to show up again, to prove that gratitude could roar as loudly as engines. So she dragged her table back to the same corner, her mother watching from across the street. This time, her cardboard sign read, "Thank you for my brother's life." The words shimmered in black marker, trembling slightly from her uneven handwriting. Cars slowed again, but now it wasn't out of pity. It was curiosity. People recognized her, the brave little girl who hadn't given up when everyone else did. They whispered to one another. Phones came out. Pictures were taken. But Amara didn't care about that. She just wanted to make sure the world knew that kindness had saved Jonah. Then, just as the sun began to dip and shadows stretched across the road, the air changed again. A sound rose from the distance, faint at first, then swelling like a heartbeat. The rumble. That familiar growl that had once sounded like thunder now felt like music. She smiled before she even saw them. Engines filled the street once more, chrome glinting like 1,000 tiny suns. This time there were more of them, 20, maybe 30 bikes, lined like an army of noise and hope. And leading them was the same man with the silver beard, the one who had placed the envelope on her table. The crowd that had gathered stepped back. Some clutched their phones, others simply watched in awe. The bikers parked in perfect formation, engines purring low like tamed beasts. Amara stood frozen, her heart sprinting inside her chest. The bearded man dismounted, removed his helmet, and smiled. That same quiet smile that carried more gentleness than words ever could. He walked toward her, his boots clicking against the asphalt. He looked at her sign, then at her face. Without speaking, he nodded. Amara's throat tightened. She held up a cup of lemonade with both trembling hands. He took it, raised it slightly like a toast, and drank. Then, turning toward his riders, he said something that made them all laugh softly, a sound like thunder breaking into light. One of them brought out a small leather pouch and placed it beside her jar. Inside were dollar bills, coins, and a folded note. Amara didn't open it. She only whispered thank you, her voice barely audible over the rumbling of engines. The man knelt down so their eyes met and said quietly, "Your brother will make it. You've done your part. Let us do ours." When he stood, he placed something in her hand, a small metal pin shaped like wings. She looked at it, confused, until he said, "Keep this. It means you've got angels watching." The engines roared to life again, filling the air with their deep, rolling symphony. The riders waved as they pulled away, the wind whipping through their jackets, the sunlight catching on their chrome like sparks. Amara watched them until they disappeared beyond the curve of the road, the sound fading into the horizon like a promise carried by thunder. That night, the hospital glowed brighter than usual. Nurses hurried through the halls, doctors whispered updates, and Amara clutched the metal pin in her fist as if it could hold the world together. Her mother sat beside Jonah's bed, whispering prayers under her breath. The surgeon entered, mask hanging at his chin, and said softly, "Tomorrow morning. First light." Amara barely blinked. Her heart was a drum, steady and fierce. Tomorrow. It was really happening. Outside, the night hummed with rain that never quite fell. The smell of wet asphalt drifted through the open window, mingling with the sharp scent of disinfectant. Amara sat by the bed, watching her brother breathe, counting the rise and fall of his small chest like it was a song. She thought about the bikers, about the way people had laughed at her, about how easily kindness can be mistaken for foolishness, until it saves a life. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion pulled her into sleep. And in that sleep, she dreamed of engines, not loud or terrifying this time, but steady and protective, circling her brother's hospital like guardians. When she woke, the first light of morning was already spilling across Jonah's bed. Nurses were moving around, preparing the room. Her mother squeezed her shoulder and whispered, "It's time." And for the first time in weeks, Amara didn't feel afraid. The morning of Jonah's surgery came with the kind of light that feels too sharp for mercy. It sliced through the hospital blinds, painting white stripes across Amara's face as she sat upright in the waiting chair, her little fingers gripping the small silver pin the biker boss had given her. She hadn't let it go all night. It had become more than metal. It was hope she could hold, a reminder that even the loudest storms could bring angels with engines. The hallway outside the surgical unit buzzed with controlled chaos. Nurses moved quickly, the wheels of gurneys clicking over tiled floors, the smell of antiseptic thick enough to taste. Amara's mother stood beside her, clutching Jonah's file to her chest like a shield. Her face was calm, but her eyes betrayed the thousand silent prayers she was whispering under her breath. Jonah was already inside the operating room, swallowed by a world of white coats and cold lights. Amara felt small, smaller than she'd ever been. Her stomach was tight, her throat dry. She could still see Jonah's weak smile before they wheeled him in. He had squeezed her hand and mouthed the words, "Don't cry." That memory looped inside her like a heartbeat she couldn't slow down. Hours dragged like years. The hospital clock ticked in slow defiance, each second sounding heavier than the last. Amara's mind spun. What if it didn't work? What if all those bikers' kindness led only to another heartbreak? The thought was a shadow she couldn't chase away. Her mother noticed and placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. "Faith," she whispered. "Just faith, my child." But faith was fragile when you've already seen too much pain. Then, a low rumble broke through the hum of the hospital. It started faint, like thunder rolling somewhere far beyond the walls. Heads turned. People paused. Nurses glanced toward the entrance, confused. The sound grew louder, closer, until the windows vibrated gently. Amara froze. That sound she could never mistake. Engines. One after another, they came, roaring like an army of lions through the hospital gates. Chrome flashing under the morning sun, black jackets glinting with patches, helmets reflecting blue sky. It was the same gang, the same men who had changed everything. And this time, there were even more. They didn't sneak in. They arrived with purpose. The sound filled every corner of the hospital compound, steady, unified, like a drumbeat of protection. People gathered near the windows, their whispers buzzing through the halls. "Are those bikers?" someone asked. "What are they doing here?" Amara ran to the window, pressed her palms against the glass, and gasped. The leader, the silver-bearded man, was right at the front, standing tall beside his bike. He removed his helmet, revealing that same steady calm that had frightened people once, but now felt like safety itself. He looked up toward the building, and even from that distance, his gaze seemed to find her. He nodded once. A promise. The entire hospital entrance transformed into a sea of leather and engines. The bikers stood in silence, heads bowed. A prayer without words. They weren't there for trouble. They were there for Jonah. The nurses at the reception desk exchanged bewildered glances, unsure whether to call security or stand in awe. One of them whispered, "They said they'd be here until the surgery ends. They're not leaving." Amara felt something bloom inside her, something electric and uncontainable. She turned back to her mother, who was staring out the window in disbelief, her hand over her mouth. They came, Amara whispered, her voice trembling. They came for him. Minutes turned into hours. Inside the operating room, Jonah's small body lay under harsh white light, his heart struggling through the precision of skilled hands. Outside, the engines remained silent now, like an army standing guard. Some of the bikers formed a circle near the hospital steps, hands clasped, heads down. Others leaned on their bikes, silent, waiting. They didn't need to be told what was happening inside. They knew the fight wasn't just Jonah's, it was theirs now. Inside the waiting room, the air was thick enough to choke on. Every time the door to the surgical unit opened, Amara's heart jumped. Her mother paced in small circles, whispering the same prayer again and again. Amara clutched the silver pin tighter, whispering too. But she didn't pray in words. She prayed in pictures, her brother running in the park, laughing, chasing bubbles. She prayed in the memory of the roar of engines that had sounded like thunder and turned out to be grace. 3 hours. 4 hours. Then 5. At the 5th hour, the door finally opened. The surgeon stepped out, his mask pulled down, sweat shining on his forehead. For a long, terrifying moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at Amara and her mother. His eyes softened. It was difficult, he began. But your brother, he made it. The words didn't sink in immediately. They just hung there, hovering like light that hadn't decided where to land. Then Amara's mother collapsed into the nearest chair, covering her face, sobbing into her hands. Amara stood frozen, the silver pin still in her palm, tears already streaming down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. He's okay, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The surgeon smiled tiredly. He's sleeping now, breathing on his own. You can see him soon. The hallway erupted with relief. Nurses clapping softly, strangers smiling, even the janitor wiping his eyes with his sleeve. And outside, as if on cue, the engines roared again, a thunderous chorus that shook the ground. The noise startled everyone inside. The surgeon blinked and smiled. Is that for him? Amara ran to the window again. The bikers had started their engines all at once, revving them in unison, not in rebellion, but in celebration. The sound rose, deep and powerful, vibrating through the glass, through the walls, through every beating heart in that building. It was music. It was gratitude. It was love, loud enough to make heaven listen. People gathered outside the hospital doors, clapping and cheering. The silver-bearded biker lifted his hand high, signaling the others to quiet down. Then he turned toward the hospital and raised his fist in salute. Amara pressed her hand against the window, mirroring him, her eyes wet. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had stopped just to breathe. When Jonah was finally moved to recovery, Amara walked into the room with her mother. The machine still hummed softly, but his breathing was steady now, stronger, calmer. His cheeks had color again. Amara brushed a stray curl from his forehead, her heart bursting with something too big for her tiny frame. Her mother sank to her knees beside the bed, whispering thanks to God, to the doctors, to those men outside who had changed the story of her children's lives. Outside, the bikers stood in formation, waiting until the doctor came out to confirm the success. When the news reached them, they erupted in applause, helmets raised high in triumph. And then, in one unified motion, they mounted their bikes again. The engines came alive like thunder returning to the sky. As they rode away, one by one, then in clusters, the townspeople who had mocked Amara before stood on the sidewalks, silent. Some clapped. Others bowed their heads. The same people who had once laughed at a child's lemonade stand now watched in awe as the so-called outlaws became the heroes of their town. Amara stood by the window, watching the last bike disappear into the horizon. The silver-bearded man was the last to leave. Before he did, he looked up one final time and lifted his hand in salute. She smiled through her tears and did the same. The roar faded. The day quieted. And somewhere in the stillness, Amara knew kindness didn't always wear white wings. The sun returned brighter than ever the next morning, pouring through the hospital windows as if heaven itself was celebrating. The storm had passed. Hope had a heartbeat again. Jonah's tiny chest rose and fell with ease. No machines this time, no wires snaking across his skin. Just life, steady and unbroken. His mother couldn't stop crying, her tears falling in quiet waves of gratitude, while Amara stood at the foot of the bed, clutching the silver pin until her fingers ached. The room smelled of disinfectant and sunlight. Nurses came and went, smiling softly as they checked vitals. One of them whispered, "That little boy's miracle brought half the town back to life." And she was right. Outside, the hospital gates had turned into something like a festival. People Amara had never met came with flowers, fruits, envelopes, and even toys. Some came just to say sorry. Sorry for walking past her lemonade stand. Sorry for laughing when she begged the world to care. Now, they stood together in shame and awe, realizing that the courage they mocked had saved a child's life. When the door opened again, a gust of sound followed, the deep growl of engines rising in the distance. Amara's head snapped toward the window, her pulse racing. Her mother froze, too, her lips parting in disbelief. It was them again. Dozens of motorcycles rolled into the hospital compound, black and chrome gleaming under the midday sun. Their leader, the silver-bearded biker boss, led the way, calm, steady, and unhurried. They parked in perfect formation, their engines silencing all conversation around. Even the guards at the gate didn't dare to move. The air itself seemed to bow to their arrival. When they removed their helmets, it wasn't rebellion you saw in their faces, it was pride. Pride for the little girl who refused to give up. Pride for the miracle they'd helped create. Pride that for once, the world could see what true brotherhood looked like. The leader walked through the hospital doors, his boots echoing across the tiled floor. Nurses stepped aside, unsure whether to be afraid or to smile. But he didn't stop until he reached Jonah's ward. Amara's eyes went wide as he entered. The room fell silent. For a second, no one breathed. Then, the roughest voice in the building broke the quiet. "He made it," the biker said, his tone low and warm. "That boy's stronger than half the men I've known." Amara's mother stood, speechless. The biker looked down at Jonah, still sleeping peacefully, then turned to Amara. "You did this," he said. "You didn't give up when the world walked past. You reminded us what real strength looks like." He reached into his jacket and brought out an envelope, placing it beside Jonah's bed. "For his school," he said. "For his future. And for yours." Amara tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. She just nodded, her eyes flooding. He smiled, a small, knowing curve of the lips that carried the weight of 1,000 miles of road. When he turned to leave, he paused at the door, glancing back at her. "You keep that pin close, little one," he said. "You've got a family on the road now." And then he was gone, the hallway filling again with the sound of boots, leather, and quiet reverence. The bikers started their engines one by one, the roar shaking the glass and stirring the flags outside. Every head in the hospital turned toward the sound. It wasn't noise anymore. It was a victory song. Amara and her mother stood by the window, waving as the bikes rolled out, their engines roaring in unison, their formation sharp and proud. The silver-bearded boss looked back one last time, lifted his hand in a salute that was half blessing, half farewell, and the others followed. The roar of their departure faded slowly into the afternoon wind, leaving behind silence, but not the heavy kind. This was peace. This was what redemption sounded like after thunder. In the days that followed, Jonah's recovery became the heartbeat of the town. Neighbors who once mocked came with gifts. Reporters showed up with cameras. Headlines flashed across social media. Bikers save little boy's life after lemonade stand goes viral. The story spread beyond the small town, reminding the world that kindness could wear leather jackets and ride steel horses. Weeks later, when Jonah finally came home, the bikers returned once more, not with noise this time, but with joy. They carried gifts, balloons, and a small plaque that read, "To the bravest little girl we ever met, from your Hell's Angels." Amara stood on the front porch with her brother, waving at the long line of bikes that had filled her street once again. Her mother couldn't stop smiling. The same town that had once looked away now lined the sidewalks, clapping and cheering. The bikers revved their engines in salute before roaring off into the sunset, leaving dust, laughter, and hope swirling in their wake. That night, as stars blinked awake across the sky, Amara sat beside Jonah's bed, the silver pin gleaming softly under the moonlight. Her mother slept nearby, peace finally returning to her tired face. Amara whispered a prayer, not just for the bikers, but for everyone who still walked past lemonade stands, blind to the miracles waiting to be noticed. Somewhere in the distance, faint but clear, came the hum of an engine, deep, steady, familiar. Amara smiled, clutching the pin against her chest, because she knew. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes, they ride motorcycles. And that's how one little girl's courage turned thunder into a miracle. The world may forget her name, but not her story. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button now. Drop a comment saying, "Never give up," to keep stories of hope and kindness alive. Because sometimes, the smallest act of faith can change everything.